G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to go through 8 things that you can do to instantly improve the effectiveness of any muscular stretch that you might be doing. Because I think the current culture around stretching is that stretching has become this thing that you just have to keep doing in order to bring yourself up from a negative position to baseline, as opposed to something that we do to consistently keep improving the overall function of our tissue, the overall function of our bodies, but also getting to a point where we no longer have to keep doing that stretching long term. So the first tip that I think is really important to improve the effectiveness of your stretching is it's important that we sequence the stretch correctly. So in terms of the couch stretch, as we've seen before, what we want to do with this is we want to get your knee back into the wall. We want to place your other leg up into this high kneeling position, and ultimately come up as tall as you feel you can to open up a lot of the tightness and the tissue restrictions that we might find at the front of the hip and the front of the thigh. But what we need to do here in terms of sequencing is if you know that the end point of a stretch is to go back as far as you feel comfortable, then ultimately we can miss where you're extending through or moving through, and sometimes that can be at the expense of loading up the correct area. So if I know that I'm trying to open up the front of the hip here, then it's really important that if I extend my back first, I can get back really far, but most of that motion's going through my back, it's not going through the front of the hip. So in order to sequence this correctly, what I want to make sure that I do is squeeze my butt cheek. I want to make sure that this hip joint, the front of this hip joint, is the area that I'm extending through the most. As soon as I find that end point, I'm not necessarily going back as far. I can go back much further if I extend my back, but the purpose of this stretch is to make sure that I'm isolating the joint that I'm trying to stretch before anything else. And once I've come up to a point where I've biased the area that I'm trying to stretch, that I can feel a genuinely healthy stretch in that area, it brings us to tip number 2. Once you're in a good position, we can then hunt around and change the angle of that stretch to try and find the best version of that stretch for ourselves. So with the couch stretch, for example, once I've come up to this point, if I then push my hips forward a little bit, it increases the stretch. But similarly, if I begin to rotate to one side or rotate to the other side, as I rotate around to this position, I can feel a greater, more authentic and more positive stretch for what I'm looking for compared to whether I was just in line to begin with. So if you're doing another stretch, for example, where you might be doing a hip stretch or a glute stretch, what we can do here is we can wind that hip up into a position that biases that tissue. But if I hinge forward from my hips to find a juicy tightness there, something that feels really important for me, I can then gently rotate to the side or gently rotate away from that to enhance that stretch or try and find the version of that stretch that's important to me. So in dealing with the third tip here, it's really important that we find a safe level to stretch. So this is an interesting concept, and I think it's really applicable to the couch stretch because this position can be quite brutal and quite uncomfortable for a lot of people. The whole no pain, no gain mindset doesn't work with stretching. So if you find that you come up to a certain point and you think, oh, I can't really talk, I'm holding on for dear life, it actually goes against the concepts and the processes that need to happen for your brain and nervous system to feel safe and relax and allow that tissue to give. So with any stretch that you're doing, what I would advise is start in a really safe position, then just gently come up to the start of that tightness that you feel before doing some of the things that we're going to go through in the next tip. Because once you've found your safe level, we can move on to tip number 4. And that's we want to use this contract relax or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation technique, or PNF for short, in order to activate that muscle tightness to get your brain and nervous system involved in another way. So once you've found that safe level, what you want to do is you want to come up, sequence it correctly, bias it enough to figure out where your best tightness is at a really comfortable level. Because once you've found that tightness, probably the most important foundational concept to take away from this video is the contract relax or PNF stretching. I want to get you to tense up that muscular tightness. So any stretch that you do, once you've found that stretch, you want to squeeze that tension, squeeze that tight spot for anywhere between 5 to 10 seconds. Once you release that, your brain and nervous system has this sort of reflexive response where your tissue starts to release and give, and you should instantly feel like you can come back a fraction further straight away. So again, make sure that you see that immediate change, otherwise you haven't made change. And then following on from this, tip number 5 is that we can add a band to your stretch to make it more effective. So what we want to get you to do with this is any stretch that you might be doing, If you have what's called a Powerband or a jump stretch band or a monster band, it's one of these thick bands that I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check them out. But these bands are phenomenal at improving and optimizing any particular stretch. And the reason for that is when we use a band and hook that band around the joint, it starts to include the joint capsule in the conversation. And we can eke out a little bit more mobility, a little bit more flexibility to try and change that tissue quality straight away. So what we want to do, we want to hook the band into the joint. So for me, this band's going to go underneath the gluteal fold or underneath that butt cheek in order to bias the front of that hip joint. So I'm going to place that band right up there. And we want to come back again into that couch stretch position. Now, ultimately, you're going to have the band pulling directly forwards. But what this is doing, the tension on the band is pulling the joint into more of an extended position. It's opening up the front of the hip a little bit more, which is what I'm trying to do with the stretch. So if I was trying to do my hamstrings, for example, and I was leaning forwards, I'd have the band pulling backwards. If you were doing a wrist stretch, for example, or you wanted to improve the flexibility of your wrist flexors through here, you can place the band into your wrist and go in the opposite direction of where the band's pulling. So those first 5 tips account for some of the technical aspects of how to make your tissue stretching more effective. These next few tips are really important conceptual ideas to make sure that you're getting your head around. So again, ultimately improve the effectiveness of what you're actually trying to do. So the 6th thing that I want to talk about here is that it's really important to understand the cause of why your muscles have become tight in the first place if you're then trying to make the most progress long-term with your mobility. Muscular tightness is there for a reason. It's not just like a shortened piece of elastic that becomes sort of tight and restricted over time. Muscular tightness serves a purpose governed by your brain and nervous system. And for the most part, it's trying to compensate for a weakness somewhere, it's trying to compensate for some poor positioning or some poor mechanics, or it's trying to support something in the face of something else being a problem. And we're talking about the hip flexors, for example. Sitting is often the most common cause of why a hip flexor becomes tight, closely followed by lower back dysfunction. Because again, the function of your hip flexors is intrinsically linked to your lower back because they're attached to the front of your lower back. So if you're someone who's consistently having to stretch your hip flexors to be better athletically or to solve some pain, and you're not then taking a look at how often that you're sitting versus how often that you're standing, or if you're sitting in some really bad shapes consistently, those muscles are consistently going to get the message to stay tight and restricted, and any long-term stretching will ultimately be nullified or reduced in its effectiveness until you can change that and shift that balance back in your favor. If we're looking at muscular tightness through your upper body, often that can relate back to your neck and your spinal positions and shapes that you put your neck into. Same things with your calves and hamstrings. There's going to be a lower back or a shoe-related dysfunction in terms of heels or thongs or flip-flops that might be asking that tissue to be tight perpetually that you need to sit down and understand in order to get the results you need long-term. So the second last tip that I think is really important for you to understand and work towards if you're trying to improve the effectiveness of the stretches that you're doing is that we need to make sure that the muscle that you're trying to stretch is strong. One of the things we want to try and do again is we want to replace the signaling that your brain has that something needs to be tight and restricted to create some stability or some strength in an area. So the interesting thing about strengthening is we don't just have to strengthen the area that feels tight and restricted. We also need to take a step back and strengthen some of the muscles around the area that might be asking that to be tight in the first place. For example, if you have some gluteal weakness and your hip flexors are potentially trying to also compensate for some of that gluteal weakness, which is directly next to it, then obviously any stretching or strengthening that you do of that hip flexor will help it become more robust and more tolerant. But if it's being caused by some muscular strength issues surrounding that, then obviously improving that as well makes a big difference. And the 8th and final tip, which is potentially the most simple, but also potentially the most effective, is that we need to use the area day to day. So if you're someone, again, who's trying really hard to undo some of the tightnesses at the front of your hip or in your neck or in your shoulders or wherever it might be, but you're not actually using that tissue and using that tissue through its full range of motion, again, it's hard to expect your body to be mobile, to stay mobile in the future. Because again, in theory, we shouldn't necessarily have to be stretching day to day. We're only stretching to reclaim a lot of things that the modern world has robbed from us, essentially. If we're just moving our body through full range of motion all day, every day, there becomes less and less reason for that tissue to be tight. So again, if you're someone who has some tight hip flexors and you're not getting into positions where, for example, you might be lunging down or taking that hip through its full sort of extension range of motion in terms of a split squat or something like that, then again, we're not using that tissue and communicating that new range of motion to our brain so it can map that out and value that specifically. So as I said, with each of those tips, they should individually help add a little bit more effectiveness to the stretches that you're working on. I want to make sure that we shift our expectations with stretches away from, I just have to do this every day to get myself to the starting line. I want to make sure that your baseline is pretty good, or at the very least, everything that you do is consistently getting you a step closer to where you want to be mechanically or physically or functionally, because you shouldn't deserve to do this kind of stuff forever. So again, I genuinely hope those tips were helpful. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're new. But having said that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.